We're going to give folks a minute to get in. Good evening, y'all.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm late. Salam.
Well, welcome everyone to Make It Make Sense, Balancing Activism and Spirituality. I'm Sienna Abdullahad, and I have the honor of serving as the Director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs at the Carolyn Barber Pierre Center for Intercultural Life here at Tulane. And I wanted to introduce our moderator for tonight, Dr. Paula Book. Dr. Book is the director for the Center of Academic Equity at Tulane University within Newcomb Tulane College. And she has a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. And her research focuses on the politics of racial and religious identity in American life, pedagogy, and the impact of equity and inclusion practices on the undergraduate student experience. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Book, who will moderate and introduce our featured panelists.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be with you all today and to have this conversation. What's thrilling to me is that this conversation provides so much of a window into the work of social justice and how we engage in creating a better world. And tonight we have three amazing panelists who will lead us through this discussion. I'm going to offer them up to introduce themselves and the work that they're doing. So I want to thank first Ruth Arekula, Florentina Cruz, and Jenny Yang for joining us today. And if you would be so kind, in the order that I have shared your name, to share out a little bit about who you are and the work that you do.
Sure. Thank you, Paula. My name is Ruthie Dakula, as Paula shared. I consider myself a community organizer, and I've been doing anti-racist work in New Orleans and nationally for the past 20 years. Proud resident of New Orleans. I've also done work with the Tulane Center for Public Service for several years, the past two more intensely, teaching a couple of classes that are rooted in justice work. And alongside with that, I am a spiritual leader in the, I call it more of a cultural and spiritual practice called Ifa that it comes from the Yoruba people of Nigeria. I am what's called a Ielosha Olorisha, and that has been my faith for the past 18 years. So that's just a little bit about who I am and what I do, and I'll pass it on to Fiorentina.
Hi, y'all. I'm grateful to be here with the students. Even though I can't see you, I know you are there, and that makes me very happy. So my name is Florentina Stegers, actually Florentina Ramirez Stegers Cruz, any of which combinations are fine. And right now I am working with families and friends of Louisiana's incarcerated children as their communications director. In the past, I've worked a lot in policy and racial justice, some gender justice work in Cameroon. And also, I would say that, you know, I've sort of done some consulting mainly in racial healing work. And so my spiritual self is rooted in, I grew up Catholic, and then also sort of began seeking something different because that wasn't really resonating with me as a young adult. And so I ended up practicing Buddhism for quite a while. I also am engaged in some yogic practices, and I am ordained in the tradition of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Vietnamese Buddhist Zen master and was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King. So it was really rooted in the anti-war activism of the American war in Vietnam. I'm also rooted in my own sort of traditional Mayan spirituality that is coming back to my indigenous roots as a Maya person. My mother's from El Salvador. And then finally, I've sort of made my way back to Catholicism and am practicing Catholicism as well. And I will pass it to Jenny.
Hi, assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Que la paz sea con vosotros. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you is the best greeting that Muslims give, and many of also familiar with that. Like Florentina, I grew up in a different. I grew up Catholic, and in a different tradition, and grew up giving each other peace in mass. So some things continue to stay the same. But I accepted Islam at the University of New Orleans many years ago, over 25 years ago, and since then, for me, my accepting of Islam had a lot to do with my belief in social justice, and especially where that kind of connected with me being a woman. So this was a very important part of my conversion, but I was used to being active in college, and I continue to do my best to use my voice when I can, to use my hands to enact change. And I helped recently, more than a year ago, I helped start Voces Unidas, which is a coalition that trying to abolish ICE and help a lot of our asylum seekers locally, which Ms. Marta Guerra continues that work. And I work for a community organization, which is a humanitarian organization, nonprofit called ICNA Relief, Islamic Circle of North America Relief, which does domestic relief work. And I'm the representative for development in Louisiana. We run food pantries and other things to alleviate the difficulties that many people face. And although I believe that this is necessary, I also believe it is a band-aid to the greater picture, which is a social injustice. And because of that, I try to be active in many different ways, but it is because of my belief that we are vicegerents on earth of God, and the way that we act should be to really wish for others what we want for ourselves. I'm Latina, as in my background is culturally Cuban, Caribbean, but ethnically from Spain. So there's a few intersections there. And I'm really grateful to be in this company.
Thank you all for sharing a little bit about your backgrounds, who you are. I'm excited to launch into this conversation, and I think maybe one of the great places to start is around the idea of how you conceptualize spirituality. In my own work, I often focus on religious beliefs as being broken down into two parts. The first is theology or content, and the second is practice. It is the rituals and the context that bring a belief to life. And for me, spirituality is that piece that weaves through both of those different segments. And so my question to you is, first, do you define spirituality? And secondly, how does that connect to the work that you're doing?
You want us to go in the same order?
Yes, whatever order makes sense for you as you come to this question.
Okay. Very simply for me, spirituality is one's own personal connection with, some people call it the divine, some people call it that which is bigger than what you are. And that can mean all kinds of things. That can look like community, that can look like the world, that can look like divine beings, seen and unseen. There's the whole totality of that. My belief is that each individual's journey, whatever it may look like on this planet, is for you to be able to reflect the divine. There's this concept, there's this African concept that kind of weaves through culture. And I know that a lot of people say, which is true, that Black or African people are not monolithic, but there is what I call a golden thread that is woven through all cultures, which is the understanding that the divine lives in all of us, right? And that we all can be gods or goddesses with little g, right? And so it is to pull that within you that is wonderful, that is powerful, and that is to make the world a better place. And that is woven, of course, through culture and through religion in the various forms in terms of our understanding about who and what God is, who and what spirit is, and how we as communities, peoples, cultures, how that's reflected in the way that we do everyday life. With regards to my work, which is primarily around, I see myself more as a humanitarian above anything else, which is that each human being has a responsibility to uplift and to make the world a better place. You know, as cliche as that sounds, I really honestly and truly believe that. And if I understand that everybody around me also is a product or a member or a child of the divine, that which is bigger than us, then I need to treat them that way, right? And that we all have immense power and that we all have a contribution that is valuable in all of its different ways and manifestations. So I'll leave it there. I could say a lot more, but I'll let others chime in.
Thank you. And sorry if I don't know if you can see my pug. He's coming in and out. He wants to be part of this conversation. But, you know, I love that. I think the simplest question can also be the most complex question in terms of, you know, what is spirituality and, you know, what that means to me. And, you know, I like sort of the framing of belief and practice. And so, and I would say that, you know, what helps me frame this is actually in Buddhism. And this is sort of a framework that I use even when after I meditate, I say some prayers, which is definitely sort of a combination of sort of the Buddhist and Catholic practices. And those are, you know, sort of based in this framework of taking refuge in my tradition. And that's taking refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha. And the Buddha, in sort of my own thinking and belief, and as well as practice, I view that as just the good in everybody, sort of this innate part of us that is loving and kind and compassionate, and just having, you know, sort of growing that seed of those qualities in ourselves is definitely part of my practice. And then also when I look at the Dharma, which, you know, could be translated as the teachings, like, to me, that's also just a path of love and understanding and trying to seek out things that resonate with us in, you know, whatever sort of form that is. That can be a walk in nature. And, you know, I loved that, Ruth, you started with sort of this idea of connecting and connection, because that was also my first thought of, spirituality is connection to something sort of larger than oneself, and whether that be nature or our own DNA, or something that we define as God. I see the teachings as a sort of a way to get there, a way to access that, and that looks different for everybody. And then the community, it can simply even just be like a great group of friends that are able to reflect back those things, that can reflect back truth, and that can reflect back that innate good in all of us, those qualities of love and understanding and compassion. So surrounding ourselves with some really great beings, whether that be, even our dogs, or, cats, or just so many beings, the trees, those can be our community. So, and yes, and in my work, I think that, it's funny because I've been trying to define this like fight for racial justice so much in terms of policy and law. But I think in the end, what it really gets to is trying to grow those three things, grow community, grow sort of an understanding, and grow compassion. And in Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, we're sort of focused on incarcerated youth, and how are we growing our hearts to include everybody? And certainly when we look at policies, they are not inclusive of everyone, and so how are we changing that? And Yanni?
And of course, in spiritual practice, there's so much that is going to resonate from what one of us says and another one says, because there's so much similarities, right? Because there might, even from one person to another that identify in the same faith, they may identify spirituality a little bit different, because really it is that connection to each other, and also our connection. In my case, I believe in a creator, in an almighty God, but I believe that we are connected. And I something that Florentina said, Muslims believe that before our souls were put into our physical bodies, we were all the souls that the Almighty created were gathered together in a place, and we experienced and witnessed him. And then whenever our souls were put in our body, when it was destined for us to be born, but our souls had an experience before that. And there are some that say that sometimes these souls recognize each other in life because we were close to each other before we were created. But the idea of connection, of humans being connected to each other and being connected to God is a very important part of spirituality in Islam. So, which is important with activism. But as a Muslim, my understanding of Islam as a Muslim is also that in getting closer to God, there's a anxiety. Anxiety is the opposite of this pure spiritual peace. And of course, we believe that there's no perfect peace in this world, that there's always grief. And if you don't have any personal grief, and if you are blessed not to experience any grief in this life, never lost anyone you loved, or never been ill, if you are blessed to be someone like that, which we all really do experience grief, but even then, the grief of others in mankind, you experience that. So we all collectively experience some form of grief in this life. And part of the beauty of the afterlife, as a Muslim, I believe, is that we speak to each other. It is a place of pure peace. It's a place of where grief does not exist. So yeah, there is a connection, and connection to all things that bring you closer to your creator, including to those things that he created. And again, just because I follow Florentina, she said that it could be the trees, it could be birds, all of these things Muslims believe are creations of God. So if you reflect on them, and we call them ayahs, which are also the verses of the Quran are called ayahs, which means signs. It just means signs of the creator. So these things should make you see what's greater than yourself. But spirituality also, in Islam, in my understanding, is also finding meaning. And it could be your meaning is to go back to the nature of your soul, which is to be in the presence of the Almighty, in presence of God, like for your soul to be in the next life, which was before your souls were created, put in your body. So to actually be in a place of pure peace where you are in um, without any grief. But it is also spirit. Spirituality also is um, connected to how with the meaning you put in your life in this life, where you're able to alleviate someone's else's grief or connect with them, or it's the meaning that you give your life helps you connect. And there's no way a Muslim can find meaning in this life without really having a pure submission that one day we will be reunited with our creator, and that is the ultimate of the pleasure.
Thank you guys. That was really beautiful. One of the things that I'm hearing from what you shared is this common thread about spirituality as being located somehow first within us, and then within the larger community, and then extending out even into nature. In Protestant Christianity, which is my tradition, I think the best way to think of the location of spirituality as within us is in the concept of image bearers. And so we are all, created in God's image, and therefore we bear that image. And because of that, we have an obligation to each other, right? That dignity to see each other, to support each other, and then to the world, which is a part of the created order. And one of the beautiful things there is that tie between God, the creator, but because we're image bearers, we are inherently creative beings. And so that connection to nature and to stewardship comes through as well. So I'm just loving this thread that that you're sharing across all of your thoughts on sort of what is spirituality and how it's connected to the work that you do. So my next question is about spirituality and religiosity. Often these ideas get marshaled by both oppressors and marginalized communities, right? So folks are looking for a way to connect their actions to divinity in some meaningful way. So how do you engage folks who seek to use spirituality to justify their unjust goals? And then I think we'll continue to go in that same order, if that's okay with you.
You are muted. Famous words of the past year. Um, um, I think I understood your question. But if I'm not, if I start talking and I'm not speaking to your question, then please feel free to interrupt me. I'll use an example. So we all understand that, all folks have a particular understanding of the divine or the way they practice religion or spirituality in the place that they come from, right? But we understand that colonization is a thing that has happened, and in some ways it still is very much. And so, for instance, I was raised a Christian, very strong Christian family that really had almost I'm going to call it that. I'm going to say almost a prejudice to folks who practiced our own indigenous religion, right? So, for example, I was told that I need to stay away from the people who dance at night in white, right? And that, you know, those are bad things and you shouldn't be involved with them and just stay away. And then I found out much later in my life that those people were actually Yoruba people who were practicing their indigenous culture called Ifa, which is what I practice now. And so I think that, unfortunately, that religion and all that it encompasses, right? Because as I was saying also, that it is also very much tied to people's culture um, that has been used as a tool for oppression, a tool from separating oneself from the understanding of one's connection to place, which is also in itself a connection with the spiritual, right? And I think that people who use, Western people specifically, who have used um, religion as a form of oppression have very much understood that, even a way that I think that those of us who have been colonized still don't get. Um, and so, for instance, I'm going to talk a little bit about reclamation. In my study of politics and political organizing, particularly here in America, in the United States, I've really wanted to glean some understanding as to kind of the progression and the ebb and flow of Black people, particularly, and because we understand for, I think, Black people, not just here, but around the continent, there is a specific, there's an intrinsic understanding of the spiritual in a way that I feel is very embedded in our culture, regardless to where it is that you come from. Um, and so, for instance, so the people who initiated me into the practice are Black folks here, descendants of enslaved Africans. It is not the people that I was born or raised or who raised me. It is the people that, when I came across the waters to this country, who embraced me um, and took me in, and I've learned that in my study of political action, specifically since the 60s, that around the era of the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, that some of the things that Black people were reclaiming was their sense of spirituality and religion, right? And to kind of shirking what is a Judeo-Christian Western understanding of God and theology and all of those things that are attached to it. And so that is when they began to embrace African culture and African forms of spirituality, right? So much so that I can come here and in the early 2000s be initiated into the system that I was not grounded in where I came from, right? And making that point to say that in itself is a reclamation of spirit, right? It's a reclamation of it was a political act, right? And so using spirituality that was that you were divided or separated from that 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 connection to place, that ground, right? That people are connected to. I'm sorry, I'm not being very eloquent with it, but the reclamation of that spiritual practice was a political act, right? It was an act of reclaiming one's freedom and one's whole self. And so I think that definitely there is historical, and it's still happening in a lot of ways. A lot of horrible things that are done in the name of religion and even spirituality. But I think that we're coming into a new consciousness where people are understanding that they can go get that back. Right. I'll pass it on.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel close to this question right now because, part of the reason that I left Catholicism was just, feeling stifled by the patriarchy of it, by the homophobia that's embedded in it. And so coming back to it, and, I often use the language of, I will practice Catholicism. I don't necessarily call myself a Catholic because I think, back to this sort of like the belief versus the practice is I may attend church, I may, go to confession, I may take the Eucharist, But I certainly don't ascribe to all the beliefs of the Vatican. And it pains me. And actually, just last night, I was ordering a mask that is LGBTQ pride to wear in my Catholic church, because it really, like, there have just been times where I'm so angry in that space about how they're using sort of these religious beliefs as a tool of oppression. That said, the way that I am able to stay in that space is by recognizing, like, even, my Buddhist space as well. It's probably the most at home I've felt in any sort of spiritual practice. But we bring everything into those spaces, in terms of our greed, in terms of our own violence, in terms of our own shadows, in terms of what we're able to not see. And so I try to just focus on the good of those there. I also try to, I guess, disrupt and challenge the space to the degree that I can. And that's true in my Buddhist space. It's true in, any space that I'm in, whether it be Catholic or a meeting at UNO of my nonfiction creative writing. So I think that's where, it's bringing those practices of, pushing people on their own inability to access that path of love and understanding. And I think it's most heartbreaking when we're seeing sort of, this tool of what should be connection used to disconnect. And I think that when we look at oppression, and, I think Ruth, has sort of, the reclamation process that she's speaking of, the way that I view that is sort of in the opposition of connection is the disconnection. And so colonization, these systems of oppression, are really a disconnection from our own humanity in many ways. And, as Yanni said, like our own inability to sort of, or no, it was actually you, Dr. Brooke, who said, seeing the image, seeing God in other people. So if we were really seeing God in other people, we wouldn't be, creating these systems that target them, that, diminish their quality of life, that do all these, horrible things and create all these systems of violence against our brothers and sisters and family. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
And being the last panelist, there's so much beautiful things that were said before me. So I hope I can add there's so much, again, in common. There's and there's things, of course, that are unique to each of us. There's hadith of in Islam, Prophet, peace be upon him, said, help the oppressed and help the oppressor. And one of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked him, well, we understand helping the oppressed, but what do you mean help the oppressor? And he said, it is your job to stop them from oppressing. So that, to me, is very powerful mandate, duty in Islam, that even to stop the hand of someone who is hurting others is as just as high a calling as it is to help those people that are being hurt. So that is that's one of the hadith that I love very much. And there's another one that informs my activism, which is if you could do something, if you see something that's wrong happening and you could do something with your hand, then use your hand to stop it. And if you can't, then use your voice to stop it. And if you can't, at least hate it in your heart. And that is the least of the levels of faith. So if you don't even hate it in your heart and you're seeing oppression happen to others, then it's an indication that you're lacking of faith and belief. Because what love can you have in your heart if you don't have love for others? And if you see them being oppressed and you don't do anything about it, don't say anything about it, and don't feel anything about it. So God knows the levels of what we can do. And of course, also This is within our abilities and within what's righteous and good, right? So many of us may feel like, I mean, I'm just gonna be very like, I normally am very blunt. Maybe sometimes you have this reaction to really like get very upset at someone who is just evil in your face. Um, that not necessarily the righteous act to raise your hand at them. That may not be, that's the um, immediate gratification is not what's going to make things better. And in Islam, the sense of immediate gratification, yes, we fast and we pray, and sometimes the gratification is immediate, but delayed gratification is okay too, which is one of the things that makes activism in Islam uh, kind of comforting about it, which is we don't expect results. That's not why we do things, because the results are not up to us. You could work your entire lifetime on something and not see that flourish. Um, and you may just work a little bit on something and see it take fruit, because it's up to God if that thing is going to come to pass. But you will be questioned on what you did and how you tried to make that change. Um, and and I think I talked a lot, and there's probably another question. So I hope I kind of answered uh, the question a little bit. Follow up with a further question. But like I
Yeah.
said, being the last panelist is is so much has been said, so beautiful before.
Yeah, I'm just inspired, both by the way there are these interconnecting pieces in all of your thoughts on this, but also by the way that you are each sort of carving out these unique moments for us to think. Uh, I was really struck by this idea about outcomes, and I think especially around social justice work, this idea of who is acting and also what acts are being brought into the world is
Did Paula freeze?
I think we're going to give her a moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Paula may be trying to, oh, there she goes, got it back in.
hi everyone. I'm
Hey.
sorry you have gone away. So glad to be back with you and rejoining this conversation. I want to make sure that if folks were already tackling a point, I don't want to step into that. But if you are ready for another question, I have one and I'm happy to share that. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. One of the pieces that was sort of resonating with me was the impact of colonization, and in particular folks from the African diaspora, and in celebrating whatever spirituality they want to in the West. For me, one of the things that I've been thinking about in depth for the past 2 to 3 years has been centered around the idea that spirituality is not necessarily unmediated, that as people are accessing spirituality, they may be doing it through a particular lens. And so for my research, it's largely focused around the idea that we have Black evangelicals and white evangelicals who are both drawing from that same religious tradition, but have vastly different political views. And how do we explain that? And the idea is that race is mediating how individuals are responding to that divine to create these different political outcomes. And so one of the things I'd love to hear from you is how you've encountered in your work the different lenses through which people are accessing spirituality and how that has shaped your interactions with them, the outcomes that you are trying to work towards.
Did Jenny or Florentina mind taking that one? I've got to think a little bit around that.
Well, I'm happy to jump in just because I feel like, you know, the lens is quite interesting in my practice because the Buddhist space that I work or that I practice in is actually, like I said, it's a Vietnamese Buddhist tradition. And so it brings a lot of these very Asian cultural components. And the monastic body of this tradition is mostly Vietnamese still. And however, sort of the lay practitioners, sort of such as me, are mostly white, and they're actually a little bit like it's an older generation. And so there's a few sort of, you know, there's a smaller like group of people of color in the tradition. Whereas in the Catholic tradition that I practice in, I actually attend like a Spanish speaking mass. And so, you know, it's a, you know, 100% almost Latino, Latine congregation. And so, you know, that's a very different lens of Catholicism versus sort of a white Western lens. So I think what's interesting is definitely just how race impacts the spiritual practice and how it resonates with me. I don't think that I could actually be in sort of a Metairie white congregation of Catholicism, but because it's so grounded in Catholic culture as well, that definitely influences my practice of it and how I view it and sort of some of the leniency that I give it. And that said, I still, like I said, get mad and also get frustrated with, I think, some of the aspects of colonization that I can see in terms of just, I guess, how there was a disconnect. Like there's talk about like, you know, not indulging in pagan beliefs, like in Catholicism. That's clearly sort of dates back to colonization of the Americas. And so, you know, I can see that, I'm cognizant of it. But like I said, I think it also just goes back to me seeing the violence and the seeds of violence in each of these spaces and how I'm working with that in my activism work and in my spirituality really isn't all that different.
Thank you for sharing that.
I was thinking particularly around my work with Unitarian Universalists, who are, for those who don't know, are a group of folks who come out of the Judeo-Christian theological background, but kind of have this more of a embracing all religions and walks of life practice kind of culture. I wouldn't say that they have a dogma necessarily. There is a theology, but I found that particularly people who practice the religion in these times tend to have a more free-flowing understanding of what it means to be a child of God, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so Unitarian Universalists tend to see themselves as very much social activists, right? They're very active politically in different areas of social justice. But what I found specifically interesting about them was how if you get a bunch of Unitarian Universalists in a room, and they are, I have to say, primarily white, with a sprinkling of folks of color, which also I find really interesting in terms of their embrace of, all religions and of all cultures. But if you get them in a room and, you kind of ask what is important, justice-wise, like what are the things that you feel need to change, or what kind of things do we need to organize around? Most of them will say will say things like environmental justice. Most of them will talk about LGBTQ rights. But I found that if you ask specifically the people of color or Black people, they will talk specifically about racial justice. And I found that there was very much a divide in terms of the urgency of what kinds of issues need to be organized around, which I think speaks to, again, around how we see oppression, right? And how it impacts us. Another thing that I found interesting historically about Unitarian Universalists is that a lot of them came from Catholicism, where they felt oppressed with regards to issues of homophobia, sexism, that kind of thing. And so what has been interesting for me is that, it's very true that the lens with which we come through an understanding of our connection to the larger whole is based on our relation to other human beings and how we feel where we feel we are on the human totem pole, for lack of a better term. Yeah, I'll pass it on to Jenny.
So one way that I understand the question is, how does like our identity or our place inside of our own faith, um, how do we feel about, or how do we work within it or around it? So I hope I kind of understood the question. Is that right, Dr. Paula?
I think that's an amazing way to tackle that. I'm excited to hear what you have to share.
Well, some people literally call this wearing my faith on my sleeve, even though it's on my head. But we've all heard that point, wearing your faith on your sleeve. You're trying to be ostentatious or trying to, be self-righteous about who you are. But this is not what the hijab means for me as a Muslim. But obviously, it's an identity that's one of the first things that you see when you see me, is that I wear the headscarf. And that is, it has in not just in the United States, but especially in the United States, but all over the world, it is not just a religious identity, it's become a political identity. So we encounter others, and when we do, sometimes it's hard for some people to get past that, into because of their stereotypes, right? So the images are very people create impressions of images that it's not necessarily you, but they may relate your image with another image, and they've already made a judgment on you. So this is how interacting with the greater world is a little difficult, of course, and not difficult, but it's challenging, so to speak, because you do kind of have to address, again, here to use another stereotype, but the elephant in the room, which is some people already have a concept of how Muslims will respond to things, what they think, like we're all big monolith, and they see you and they've already made that judgment. So it's you kind of have to talk about it, and I'm glad that I'm able to, and because I'm not very shy, I'm very outgoing, and I will talk about it, and I'll bring it up, and hopefully, try to break that ice and talk about it. Within the Muslim community is interesting, because although there's a growing number of Latino Muslims in the world and in the United States that have accepted Islam, as we know, because of colonization, people who practice, and I was just explaining to someone about does it mean to be Cuban? Like, who is Cuban? And I said, well, there's no actual people who are historically indigenous people of Cuba. So everybody who's there is indigenous to Cuba. They've been there for generations. But ethnically indigenous or historically indigenous people of Cuba do not exist because colonization wiped them out. Okay, so the people who survived and lived in Cuba are either immigrants or that not immigrants, but basically people who benefited from colonization and who came from Spain, or people who were enslaved, right? And then there's a few people that immigrated, but very few. So mostly were people who were enslaved, and then people who came from Spain, so who benefited from the colonization and took over. So this idea, and I don't want to get off track, but so the idea is that to be Latino means many things as well, but to be a Latino person in Islam in the United States is also a minority inside of a minority in the United States. And then for me, because I'm ethnically white, even though I'm culturally Caribbean, I'm ethnically white. And honestly, I have an immense amount of privilege was given to me by the Muslim community as a convert, because many people in the Muslim community who are immigrants, whether they be Arab or from India or Pakistan, they grew up in colonized states under colonization. And so they somehow have, many of them are still white aspirationalists. So when they see a convert who's white, immediately you're looked upon like, oh my God, this is so awesome. Like you know that you're white and you have so much privilege and you would choose to be part of a faith that's been oppressed. Whereas I have many friends who are Latinas and they're brown, and they do not get the same like red carpet privilege that I got when I came in the masjid. And I realized that. And I did not step back. I've been Muslim over 25 years. So I had to learn anti-racism myself. And in order to do this work, and it's I can't even tell you, it's a continuous work. And you had to realize it at many points during your life. You have to realize that you have to engage in anti-racist reflection and work. And I didn't step back at first. I said yes to everything that I was offered. And I still do. I really do want to share my voice. But just now the community is catching up on giving voices to others that don't look like me, that they're not white. And so there's all these levels, right, that I have of privilege within minorities. And then among the white community, I'm just seen as a Muslim. So I am already an outsider, but I still have privilege. I still have privilege in white America, because somehow whiteness is more important to them than being from a faith that many white people detest. And I say this as not white people as in people who are ethnically white, but I mean like people who identify as white as their identity, which many times is already an identity that means that they are somehow connected to each other by some kind of culture, which we know is a construct and is not true. So I'm not talking about people who happen to have white skin. I'm talking about people who identify as white, as a culture, as an identity, that really means that it's either them as a supremacist belief, or others, and others' cultures are not as good as theirs. So I know this is part of a much longer conversation and discussion. But yeah, so my levels of identity, it's a constant internal work, but also it depends who I'm interacting with, who they think I am.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, we see these multiple layers of intersection and connection across what you've been sharing. So I want to turn the attention to a little bit, to build on what you have shared about internal conflicts that might arise. And so I'm thinking of, are there times when you have to reconcile conflicts that may arise between your spiritual life or community and your work as an activist? What does that look like for you? I really love that question. I should say it is one that Sienna shared with me, and it has, I think, such deep roots. For me, a major point of conflict happened around the 2016 election, and recognizing that there were so many evangelicals who were, or Protestants at large, who were supporting Donald Trump. And I could not understand, like it created a moment of spiritual crisis, the way in which these people with whom I am supposed to have this connection, this shared experience, this belief, could engage in an action that was so far from what I believed was inherent in that shared faith. And so that was a moment for me that involved a lot of good conversations with girlfriends and a lot of sternly written, that never quite got sent, some of them emails to religious leaders in my community.
Thanks for offering up that example, Paula. You stumped me a little bit, because I think that what has happened with me in my personal development is that I've become very clear about what I understand people value in terms of what they understand to be religion, right? And so for me, in my work, particularly as an anti-racist organizer, it was difficult to be in rooms, or it used to be, not so much anymore, difficult to be in rooms where, particularly with, I was given the example of Unitarian Universalists, and being a facilitator around these conversations around anti-racism, and having them have a very vehement response to the understanding that Black people and other people of color, suffer from white supremacy, not just in this country, but across the globe. And them having, oftentimes, too many times, like having just very tension-filled conversations because of the abject refusal to understand or to believe or to even empathize, right? And so that has led me to understand, or to begin. It would push me to ask myself, so if we can be in the same room and agree that every human being has inherent worth, then what is it about that you're struggling with in terms of understanding that people who are descendants of enslaved Africans and people who suffer from oppression across the world who are Black, that somehow they are not deserving of that same, belief, which has caused me to kind of, for myself personally, get clear that the things that I necessarily understand in terms of what spirituality means to me may not necessarily be the same thing, that even though we say we believe these things, we're not necessarily on the same page about those things, right? And so for some people, I believe that, white supremacy is a religion, that it is an ideology and a firm belief. It is something that that unfortunately over generations and hundreds of years, that people are very rooted in, is their self-identity. It is what they are connected to. It is their connection with the things that are larger, right? And so why wouldn't it be a form of religion or a form of, so-called spirituality, a false sense, I would say. But definitely, something that they're very rooted in a way that, I believe all the things that I do spiritually and culturally, and the things that affirm me and get me up in the morning and empower me and grow me and stretch me, right? I forget what the initial question was. I feel I was making a point and then I've gotten away from it.
You are kind of right on. I think the question was about sort of that internal conflict. How do you make sense of that? And I think you're very much on track. I'll go ahead and just reread it for folks. But I was really resonating with what you were saying, and I have a really great book plug that I'd love to share with folks on that specific issue. But the question was, are there times when you have to reconcile conflicts that may arise between your spiritual life or community and your work as an activist? What does that look like for you? And then the book that I would recommend is White Too Long by Robert P. Jones, that addresses the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity, and talks in that book and provides really robust evidence about the way in which whiteness and Christianity have become fundamentally entwined in the American mind. So I think that's a good read, but please
Right.
continue.
So yeah, so that has been my struggle, but it also has lent me some understanding in the way that I do my work, so that I protect myself in terms of not putting myself in these spaces where I want to believe that, it is about one world and we all want to get to the same place, but not necessarily so. And so I've been more wise about my work that way, and I've become less traumatized in that way. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Ruth, and I feel like I'm fascinated by this idea of white supremacy as an idea, as a spiritual practice. So I'm going to think about that some more after this call. But I did want to say that yes, and so as I mentioned, the lay practitioners in my tradition are mostly white, oftentimes a very privileged community. And I find myself sometimes struggling to go and sit in that white space. I am oftentimes the only person of color in that space. And yet it comes from this tradition of activism and this monk, again, this Buddhist monk who, was tied to Martin Luther King and all this anti-war activism and efforts. And again, if I go to a monastic center in that tradition, it's, I'm practicing with people who are Vietnamese, and usually not just they're immigrants, and then some Vietnamese Americans as well. And so that feels very different, and which is, I think, goes back to this question of lens and how we're practicing. And in that space, even though I'm not culturally Vietnamese, there's a lot of just, as people of color, there's just a lot of, I think, comfort in the way that they view and practice that that spiritual practice. And so I find myself very much conflicted oftentimes, just in terms of how I, love this tradition and how it's practiced in white spaces versus the culturally Vietnamese spaces. And also then what that means for activism in those spaces. And for me, it's never enough. And I feel like I'm definitely the person having the conversations filled with tension, saying like, why is the space this way? And no, I don't want to have to take on this effort to make it more inclusive. No, I don't want to have to teach you in this space, because this is supposed to be the space where I re-energize. What I have found is then I'm mostly working online. I'm doing some, I'm practicing in sort of this tradition of other people across the United States who are also in mostly white communities. And so we have a sort of a safe space for people of color in this tradition. And so, yeah, I also, appreciate, Ruth, your journey, and maybe I need to have, I want to think about having more solid boundaries about my spaces of refuge. So thank you.
I applaud that very much. So I would affirm that for everybody.
So one of the things that I would be another elephant in the room is that even though Islam came to remove Islam as a faith and as a message from the Almighty, came to really remove the injustice of how humans have treat other humans, right? And we believe al-Islam is basically means the source of peace, and that God is the absolute source of peace. So when I speak about Islam, I'm not just talking about the revelation of the Quran with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, 1400 years ago. I'm talking about how it's existed from what we believe was the first human, Adam, which was a prophet of God, peace be upon them all. So where the source of peace comes from, which is what our faith means, the path of peace, al-Islam. Honestly, it's devoid of this racism, misogynism, anything that, God did not create this. We do this to each other. But like all faiths, many times the interpretation of many things get hijacked by men who have privilege. So I would like to say, above and beyond talking about race, it is a very male-centered faith in terms of practice. So I have faced not. And of course, I'm not arguing for like women to lead prayer or women to be imams. I'm not interested in that. It's not really part of the strong scholarship, because women have led prayers of other women for centuries, and there are women scholars in our city, and women who are alimas and scholars and have memorized Quran even in our city. But I'm just talking about the leadership, sitting on boards, teaching, having voices, religious voices at the mosque, and so just to move forward really quickly, COVID has changed that so much. Many women scholars now have been leading discussions online because we have a different platform. So things continue to change. We bring it back to the nature of what our actual faith is supposed to be. And of course, being male-centered is also part of colonization, right? But one thing that I did want to mention is about activism, and what kind of barriers we face. In my social media, it says, my social media says the director of Islam 101 program, which is basically, it was a course that I helped to found, where people come and learn at the mosque. It was 6 weeks, come to the mosque to learn about the basics of Islam. And then some people had just accepted Islam and wanted to know more about it, and some people just wanted to know more about it. And it was a free course, and we continue to teach online. But anyway, I have that on my social media as one of the little parts of my bio. And even though I have been active for a very, very long time, I became more visibly active, as in coming out in the news and that kind of visible active. And in the last administration, right before his inauguration. So I started to become more active, and I was literally told by a board member, should remove the director of Islam 101 from your bio and social media if you're going to do activism, because of their fear that like religion and politics do not connect, which is not part of our understanding of faith. But there was this fear, and I said, I'm absolutely not going to do that, because there's one of the most well-known activists in American Islam, basically, is Sheikh Omar Suleiman, who used to be an imam of our mosque in Kenner. He speaks all over the world, all over the country. He's been arrested in the offices of Congress for fighting some unjust policies before. So he's been arrested for civil disobedience, and he has 1.5 million followers on social media. He travels all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. So I basically, I use that card. I use the male card. I said, listen, he is a scholar. I'm not a scholar. He is an activist in his full right. And if he does this and he's admired for doing that, I'm not removing my little title that says I'm connected to the mosque because I was at a protest downtown. I'm not doing it. And I did it. And I continued to work with the mosque, and they dealt with it. But yeah, it's hard sometimes to speak and say, you know what, yeah, we don't normally do this, but it's not because of our faith. It's because, yeah, following the status quo that you haven't even reflected upon.
What an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful to have shared this space with you all. We are a little bit over time, and so I recognize that some folks may not be able to stay on, but we have a question. I think, Sienna, if you would share that folks might want to reflect on as we close.
Sure. How did you tackle the negative stereotypes, internal and external, or grounded and misinformed, of your faiths when you were first stepping into exploring your spirituality? Not sure if that makes sense in writing, but it is from Nikisha. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Hi, yes, your question actually makes total sense. Um, so what I practice, Ifa, is actually the kind of like the mother of what is now called voodoo, what is called Santeria in Cuba. It's called Candomblé in Brazil. It's the manifestation of there are many manifestations of it in the diaspora as African people took their spirituality and brought it to wherever there was and adapted it to their environment, right? And so, as you probably know, when you look at depictions, um, whether it's through documentaries or even, fictional depictions, they are portrayed as very savage and barbaric and not having any grounding. They're very um, just it's kind of like the typical picture of the black brute, right? Or it's highly sexualized. Um, Fortunately for me, when I took the step to embrace this practice, I had done a lot of internal work in terms of my internalized racism and inferiority, and had, actually was in the process of actively studying the history of of racism and working on building my being humbled at the feet of teachers to teach me about organizing and activism and what that looks like and what that means. And so I think I had come to a place where I was already ready to take that step, so that it was not a kind of like an internal thing for me in terms of it impacting who I thought I was or doubting myself in any kind of way. It was actually an extremely empowering process, and it changed my life. Um, and I do it over and over and over again. But for me, what it has been is a very powerful way to be able to teach the power of indigenous culture and practice and our understanding of the earth and the rules of nature and the rules of the universe that um, are so very valuable that are unfortunately being lost in so many ways. There's so much richness in the wisdom of indigenous culture, and so I give thanks every day for that. um, so yeah, that's how I would answer that question, and it's a wonderful question. Thank you for answering for asking it.
Thanks, and I won't add much because I think Ruth, answered pretty fully and completely, and appreciate that experience. For myself, also, I also just think, yes, it was a process of self-reflection and curiosity, and also I would say it was gentleness with myself in terms of when I would come up against some of those internal or external stereotypes of, if I was resisting something and I was having to sort of unpack and sort of, decolonize my own mind. It was also, trying to do that with a lot of forgiveness and gentleness to myself, as well as to others who, even just family who, were also sort of repeating back and perpetuating those types of stereotypes and oppression.
So I appreciate just listening and just sitting here. Having to add is an extra level of helping to reflect and remember that I don't always do. So I appreciate this very much. I'll give an example. I hope it's relevant because in my mind it makes sense and it connected. When I chose to wear the headscarf, because when I first converted, I didn't wear it. Sometime later, maybe a year later, I decided to put it on. And the reason I put it on is because I traveled to Saudi Arabia to visit extended family. And my husband's family. I went to visit them, and although they're not Saudi, they live there. But anyway, I was told that it is actually the law to cover. So I wanted to be respectful of the cultures, and I covered my hair. Upon my return, about a month or so later to the United States, um, I didn't want to take it off because I had put it on, and there was something interesting that happened in the airplane. I had put on the scarf in the New Orleans airport, and there were many women with scarves on in the airplane. Um, and then when we got to Saudi Arabia, that they were not wearing scarves on the airplane. But when we got to Saudi Arabia airport, they put on the scarves, and I was confused. But I was told that they wear it because they don't want to make a scene, or because it's against literally the law to wear it. Again, this is not Islam, but this is the way that this country practices it. But so they put on the scarf when they arrived at the Saudi Arabia and the airport in Riyadh, but they weren't wearing it in the airplane. But I had put it on as soon as I left my house in New Orleans before I got on the airplane, because I figured that, it just made sense to me. And so I was just, wondering about, not to judge why these women were doing it, not at all. But when I came back, I couldn't remove it. Then I realized, did I wear these for other people? And did I do this because of the law, or did I do this because of God? So I had to have an internal reflection with myself, right? So initially, I did it initially to respect the culture. But then after saying, well, why do I want to wear it? Do I want to keep it on? And while I went through that process, I kept it on instead of taking it off. And it was a difficult process. And I had to make absolutely sure. Now, wearing it in the United States is a whole different story, because nobody's asking me to wear it. On the opposite end, it's easier not to wear it here. So I went through a difficult time where I would look at myself in the mirror and I would cry. I'd literally cry. I didn't want to leave the house. I felt so subconscious of the way I looked. And I said, why am I wearing this? Do I want to wear it? Do I not? And then I realized that if I really feel that in submission to God, that this is going to bring me closer to him, then I should do it. And it doesn't matter how other people perceive me. It matters how I perceive myself. And what I learned about myself is that I had put so much of my identity and self-esteem in my looks, that I did not know how to interact with the world just based on the way I treated other people and my intellect. Because I was so used to using everything that I had to interact with the world as a young woman, that I didn't know what to do without it. And then I realized this is a spiritual growth, right? I'm not wearing this to show people I'm Muslim, but I'm wearing this because I need to develop my inside. So by doing this, I'm forcing myself to improve the inside and let go a little bit about what other people think about me on the outside. Now, through the years, I, come back to, I dressed always in black and things like that. But through the years, I've learned to pick up some more of my cultural expressions in my dress, use more color. And so I have learned to keep my spirituality, and I want other people to know I'm Muslim. And this actually, it was hard, and some days it's still hard, but it is not for what other people think. It's about me on the inside, and who am I, and why do I do this? So that question is every day. And I can't speak for all women. Again, this is a very, very intimate experience of me, and how, identifying as a Muslim and my spirituality, and how that helped me grow personally in the faith.
Thank you again for your comments and your thoughts, and responding to the students' questions. I'm going to turn over to Sienna to close us out.
I am actually going to try to bring my video back, y'all. Give me 1 second. Thank you so much, Dr. Book, and to Jenny, and to Florentina, and to Ruth. Y'all are amazing women. I get so full when y'all breathe life into these conversations and into our community, and just bring various aspects of New Orleans life to our space, which we don't do enough. But I'm forever grateful to y'all for just bringing this conversation to the forefront. Dr. Book, you're an amazing moderator. So, I'm going to be asking for you to come back again. in the
You're
future.
amazing, Paula. They're very thoughtful questions, and caused me to dig, a little bit deeper and ask myself some things that I haven't before. So I really appreciate that. And thank you again, Sienna, for the invitation all the time to be part of these conversations. It's just really awesome work that you both are doing. So I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's Women's History Month, so I just want to acknowledge and celebrate y'all. I know it's late in the month, but this has just been an amazing space where y'all have just brought a lot of energy, and we are so grateful to y'all. So have a wonderful evening. This is recorded. I will reach out to y'all to see if there are any quotes that y'all would like us to specifically share with folks who maybe couldn't have been here, but really grateful for the opportunity to just listen to y'all and talk about this particular topic across your various perspectives. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you to everyone who has attended, and know that our community partners are pretty accessible. So if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll connect you with them as we can.
Great. Good seeing everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks,
Good night.
everybody.
Thanks again.
I feel better for the conversation. So thank you all so much.
Definitely.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Night.